I would be fine, Piers, if you had Palestinian guests and you begin by asking them, do you condemn Hamas war crimes? Because what Hamas did on October 7th was a war crime. But then you should start with Israeli guests and pro-Israeli guests saying, do you condemn Israeli war crimes, which have been documented by the UN, every human rights group on the planet? You don't. You had Naftali Bennett, the former Israeli Prime Minister, on a couple of weeks ago. I watched the interview. Your opening question was, how comfortable are you with the way Israel's prosecuting the war? Right. Bit of a softball to start with. You didn't ask him to condemn Israeli terrorism, Israeli war crimes, Israeli genocide in Gaza. So a lot of people look at that and they say, they get your intention, but it comes across as a bit of a racist double standard.
Well, look, I don't think it's a racist double standard, and I think that nobody has given pro-Palestinian voices a bigger platform more consistently since October the 7th than me. And if you go back and look at those interviews, you know, I think that clips get taken out of context and people assume they know what I've said. And often it's completely misleading. I've tried to be fair-minded about it. People do ask me, do you think Israel are terrorists? And I've said no. I don't think they are, but I have repeated.
Why?
Well, I have repeated because I think they
out of interest. Why?
Because they were responding to an act of terrorism so heinous it demanded a massive military response. The question for me that's caused me a moral quandary is what is an acceptably proportionate level of response, and I don't know the answer. But I don't think you can call people responding to an act of terror on that scale terrorists for responding.
Okay. So this is a common question people ask. It's a test. It's called the Hamas test, right? Like the Hamas check, right? So in Iran, we have this test called the Qasem check to see if people, to figure out where people stand. We ask them if they supported or support Qasem Soleimani or not, just so we understand their allegiances and where they stand. It's called the Qasem check. This is the Hamas check. Do you condemn Hamas, yes or no? It's an easy question, and it's easy to answer. It's very straightforward. Anybody who can't answer that with a straightforward, like, yes, you know, I also appreciate people who just say no, because now we know where they stand. It's the people who keep dancing around it that are the most annoying, right? One of these ways of dancing around this question is asking, why don't you condemn the other side? Why don't you call out the other side as terrorists? So there's two questions. Is the other side, is Hamas, would you consider Hamas to be terrorist? And would you condemn when you condemn Hamas, would you condemn the things that they do? These sound like the same question, but they're not. They're two different questions, right? And they're both easy questions to answer. And what people usually do in order to avoid answering this question is a classic whataboutism. Do you condemn Israel? Do you consider Israel to be doing terrorism? And okay, so Israel cannot be doing terrorism. Even if they were evil, they cannot be doing terrorism. This is people's lack of understanding of what terrorism means. I mean, they're not terrorists, not that they're not doing, they cannot be considered terrorists because they're a state. All right. So a lot of people, again, I support Israel. I don't consider what Israel is doing is even remotely close to terrorism. I don't think most of what they're doing is even condemnable. I support most of what they're doing. I don't support everything that Israel does, but I support most of what Israel does. But even in a parallel universe where most of what Israel was doing was evil, they will still not be terrorists because they're a state. And again, I apply the standard even to the Islamic Republic of Iran. That's why they call them a state sponsor of terror, not a terrorist state. By definition of terrorist, you cannot be terrorist once you are a nation state. A nation state, not just a state, okay? Because it's questionable whether if you are just a state, but not an official government of a nation state, because Hamas is technically a state, but they're not the official government of a country out there, right? So Hamas could still be a terrorist group based on definitions. But when you even if you consider, I can understand why somebody might say that any state cannot be considered a terrorist group. And by that definition, they would say that Hamas is not a terrorist group. But if somebody says that, that is not a defense of Hamas. That is just like trying to abide by definitions, right? So even though I do defend Israel, when you say Israel is not a terrorist, that part is not even a defense of Israel. That's just like abiding by definitions. So that whole them being terrorists or not terrorists, like that's a linguistic semantic argument that is not even getting to the point of whether what they're doing is right or wrong. That's just like how we use language. And a lot of people who don't understand how these definitions are used get into a language game rather than trying to actually understanding whether something that is happening is right or wrong. So that's why the terrorist language, I don't think it doesn't really help, because people think that when you're saying this group is a terrorist or is not a terrorist, you're defending them or you're taking a position against them, right? Some of the most evil acts in the world are not terrorism, right? There are many things that are absolutely evil. They are some of the most greatest human rights violation, but they're technically not terrorism, right? So let's put the terrorism question aside. Now let's look at whether we can condemn it or not, right? Whether we can condemn what Israel is doing or not. So here's the problem. It's obvious that Israel, like any other nation state on the planet, has done things and is doing things that can be condemned. You know how I know that? Because of how many actions are being taken. It's just the law of large numbers. Obviously, they are doing some things that we should be condemning, because that's what there's just so many things happening. Every country, especially if a country is taking part in a war, at some point somebody is going to do something that is a crime that should be condemned. Okay, but here's the problem: we don't know which ones, right? Because most of what they're doing is okay, and also should be doing. Most of what they're doing, if they weren't doing it, we should have been condemning that. Like, why aren't you doing this? Why are you not supporting and defending your citizens and defending the integrity of your border and the survival of your nation state? So most of what they're doing should be supported and actually should be demanded. But obviously there's going to be many things there that could be condemned, but because unlike some people, they don't go and systematically take pride in their human rights violations and advertise their human rights violations and brag about their human rights violations, it takes a lot more effort and investigation to figure out which one of the actions that Israel has taken can be condemned. And here's another thing we are not going to do. Once the investigations are done, once we do have evidence of certain examples of violations of any laws, whether Israel's laws or international laws, many of them Israel will condemn itself, because it's basically violates Israel's own standards of engagement. In fact, that's the great thing about Israel. Most of the things that would be considered human rights violations are actually violations of Israel's own rules of engagement. So Israel will condemn them itself. So, but once we figure out which one of those actions should be condemned, we're not going to generalize that to the entirety of Israel. We're going to be like, yeah, that specific action over there. But we are going to, when it comes to Hamas, we are going to generalize that. We are feel comfortable generalizing that to the entirety of Hamas because it's in their charter, because it's what they advertise that they want to do, because it's systematic, because they're proud of it, because they record it and advertise it, because they promise it, because they promise a lot more of it, not just what we're saying. So when you see a Hamas fighter doing terrorism or doing something that we condemn, this is not a bad apple. This is not one example of one of their fighters doing something that the rest of Hamas condemns. This is a deliberate from the top down of the entirety of Hamas. So we could condemn the entirety of Hamas in a way that we cannot do with Israel. That's the difference. Know the difference, right? But here's the thing. Let's say that we are wrong. We are looking at this And in the same way that you could condemn Hamas, you could condemn Israel in the same way. Like, okay, they are doing evil acts and they're doing terrorism or things that we should condemn. And we could do the same thing for Israel, maybe even more. Like, let's say I'm wrong, you guys in the live chat are wrong, and we should do that with Israel as well. And we just came to the wrong conclusion. How is that racism, like Mehdi Hassan is saying? Where is he getting that from? Why can't it just be maybe that we're wrong? Why are you where did you get the conclusion? Why is it so easy for you guys just to go and say, oh, racism? Maybe we're just wrong. How is that? Where is that accusation is coming from? Like Piers Morgan, even if Piers Morgan is wrong here with his conclusions, because Piers Morgan's conclusions regarding maybe not about many things, but regarding Israel and Palestine, I think Piers Morgan is doing a really good job trying to evaluate everything, trying to do his best to come up with the right conclusion. Even if he comes to the wrong conclusion, based on what I've seen from him, it seems like it, at least, that he's genuinely trying his best to come up with the best conclusion. So where do you get this accusation of racism from? I don't understand. How do you throw it? Like, if you notice, Mehdi Hassan at the beginning, he attributes his conclusion by Piers Morgan, he attributes it to his racism. But at the end, he also accepts, like, yes, you are one of the few medias out there that has invited the most highest number of pro-Palestinian, guests. And he accepts that. He shakes like, yes, you have. Yes, you have. Well, if he has, are you going to take back your racism accusation at the beginning? Are you going to accept it, or are you just going to stay with it? So coming back to the first, how this all started, people dancing around, like, even, there are some people that accuse, like, they will condemn Hamas. They will just get that out of the way, but they do that for a second before they come and do a whataboutism. So we either have two groups of people who refuse to condemn Hamas, or they condemn. So actually, there's three groups: people who will not condemn Hamas, they will dance around it and say, I'll try to change the subject. People who will act like they already have condemned Hamas without actually saying those words. Like, they say, what you want to hear, I have already said it in my own way. But for some reason, I'm allergic to actually saying the sentence, I condemn Hamas, or I consider what they do to be terrorism. I can't say it, but I act like I've already said it. And then there's a third group of people who will, like, anti-Israeli. I'm talking about categorizing anti-Israeli people. Then the third group of people who would just come out and say, yes, I condemn Hamas, but what about Israel? But what about Israel? But what about Israel? Okay, what about Israel? What about Israel? What when it comes to condemning certain actions by Israel, I will answer you. If you say, do you condemn Israel? I'm like, which acts? If you say, do you condemn Hamas? My answer would be yes, all of it. When you say, do you condemn Israel? The entirety of it? No. Which specific acts? That's my answer. It's more complicated. When it comes to Israel, it's more complicated. Israel doesn't have a charter committed to doing violent acts of terror. Israel doesn't have a systematic top-down goal in destroying and eliminating civilians. So even if there are examples of violations, I have to see it. It's more complicated. It needs to be investigated. I'm sure that we will be able to find some of it, but it requires a lot more data and a lot more evidence. They're not a whole bunch of group of people that go around and brag about killing civilians, from the top down, the entirety of the system. I'm sure Israel has, just like any other country has, fascists, has evil people, have people who would just love killing civilians on the other side. I'm sure every country has those people. All right. But unlike Hamas, it's not the DNA of the entire country. But now that we answered all of this, let's look at this line by line and see if we have addressed everything.
I would be fine, Piers.
Let's see what Mehdi Hassan has to say.
I would be fine, Piers, if you had Palestinian guests and you begin by asking them, do you condemn Hamas war crimes? Because what Hamas did on October 7th was a war crime. But then you should start with Israeli guests and pro-Israeli guests saying, do you condemn Israeli war crimes, which have been documented by the UN?
No, which Israeli war crimes have been documented?
Do you condemn Israeli war crimes, which have been documented by the UN, every human rights group on the planet? You don't.
Okay, not every human rights. We have human rights groups that disagree with your characterization of this being. This has not been proven that these are human rights violations. This is a claim. The documentation of it is not by itself a proof. This is a claim that these are human rights violations. And again, I'm sure there will be a few that are human rights violations, but I cannot condemn any of them until it's investigated. Just because you have civilians, here's the thing, because people say, like, how could this not be a human rights violation? Civilians have died. This is what your response should be. Civilians die in every war. Based on your standards of what's a human rights violation, then every single war would be a human rights violation. And if every single war is a human rights violation, every country defending itself would be a human rights violation. So no country on this planet would be able to defend itself without actually committing human rights violations.
You had Naftali Bennett, the former Israeli Prime Minister, on a couple of weeks ago. I watched the interview. Your opening question was, how comfortable are you with the way Israel's prosecuting the war? Right. Bit of a softball to start with. You didn't know.
No, that's not a softball. That's the right question. So when it comes to Hamas, the entirety of the Hamas, would you consider them to be terrorists? Do you condemn Hamas? Because it's just one thing. It's just one thing. When it comes to Israel, you have to ask a more general question. It's a stupid question to say, do you condemn Israel? Israel is not one thing. If you ask the question, the same question that you ask about Hamas, about Israel, you're stupid, you're idiotic, like you don't understand you're not a good host of a show, because Israel is a lot more complicated. There are a lot more diverse. It's not like you don't have this unanimous view of in Israel. So if somebody asks you, do you condemn Israel, you have to look at them like they're stupid. Like, who, which part of Israel, what policy, what individual, what statement? It's Hamas. It's not like Hamas that it's all the same thing, right? So you have to look at them like funny. You have to look at them like they're like they ask a stupid question, and you have to even look at them like they're even more stupid if they ask you if Israel is terrorist, as a terrorist. Like, you're asking me if a nation state is a terrorist? Like, what are you talking about? Are you okay? Like, that's how you should look at them.
Ask him to condemn Israeli terrorism, Israeli war crimes, Israeli genocide in Gaza. So a lot of people look.
Israeli genocide. Yeah, you ask me that question. Do you condemn Israel's genocide in Gaza? Like, if they were committing genocide in Gaza, yes, I would condemn it. But I'm glad that they're not. That's the answer.
Get that, and they say they get your intention, but it comes across as a bit of a racist double standard.
What?
Racist double standard. Basically, not only do you not like the results, you're also attributing some intention to the double standard that you have no idea, that you have no like, this is so that I thought that this is so 2009. Like, are we still there, that when you call everything that you don't like, you call racist? Unbelievable.
Look, I don't think it's a racist double standard, and I think that nobody has given pro-Palestinian voices a bigger platform more consistently since October the 7th than me. And if you go back,
all right, you have. So how could he be racist if he has? Like, are you gonna apologize for calling the man racist? Anyways, I'm done with this guy.